This is Grandma Lorie with the Bible story of King Solomon's Majesty. King Solomon was the wisest and richest king ever to reign in Israel. He was the son of King David, the faithful, and Bathsheba, the beautiful queen, the third king of Israel after King Saul and King David. Solomon was very young for a king, not more than 20 years old, when he was given the heavy care of guiding a great land full of millions of people. On the deathbed of King David, David begged Solomon, "My son, you must keep the commandments of the Lord our God and never stray from him." David continued, "God has promised that there shall be rest and peace to the land while you are king, and the Lord will be with you and shall build a house where God can live among his people. My son, if you obey God, he will protect you and our country all your life." The country over which Solomon ruled was more than twice as big now as the country David had ruled. All of the enemies David had conquered were now part of Solomon's empire, and he had to rule over them as well as the tribes of Israel. It was a mammoth task with countless millions of people to rule. As soon as Solomon became king, he knew he desperately needed the Lord's help. So he went to worship at the cloth tabernacle where the altar of the Lord stood then. Remember this picture? The tabernacle was surrounded by curtains, had a big courtyard, an altar for burning, a tub for washing, and the Holy of Holies. And this is where he went to pray to the Lord. It was in a town called Gibeon. There, Solomon made many sacrifices and offerings in praise of the God of Israel. Kneeling before the altar in Gibeon, he begged the Lord, "Oh my God, help me to know how I should rule such a great nation of many millions. I am only a young man with no experience in ruling. How can I do this enormous task according to thy will?" He was very humble as he looked ahead at this responsibility. Imagine how you would feel personally to suddenly have to rule millions of people. I would be terrified, both of the mammoth job and also afraid of the great risk of assassination by people or relatives who wanted to take over my throne. No thanks. But that night, as Solomon slept, the Lord God came to him and spoke to him clearly in a dream or a vision. The Lord said, "Solomon, ask of me whatever you choose, and I will give it to you." Solomon asked God, "O Lord, you showed such great kindness to my father David, and now you have made me king in my father's place. But I am only a child, Lord. I don't know how to rule this great people. They're as many as the dust of the earth in number. Please, dear Lord, I pray that you will give me the wisdom and understanding so that I may judge this people in righteousness and may know how to rule them justly." The Lord was pleased with Solomon's request and replied to Solomon, "You have not asked of me long life nor great riches for yourself. You have not asked for victory over your enemies nor great power. Instead, you have asked me for wisdom and knowledge to judge this people. I therefore grant to you wisdom greater than any other king before you and greater than that of any king who will come after you. And because this was what you asked, I will give you more than wisdom, but also honor and riches. And if you will obey my laws and commandments, my son, as your father David did, you shall have long life and shall rule for many years." Solomon suddenly awoke and realized that his conversation with the Lord had been a dream or a vision, but so clear and perfect that he knew it was a true revelation from God. In time, all of the parts of this promise from God came true. He had great wisdom and great knowledge and could see and understand things clearly and perfectly as a gift from the Lord. There is one famous story of Solomon's wisdom that took place shortly after this. Two women came before him, each with a little baby. One baby was dead and the other was alive. Each of the women claimed that the living child was her own and the dead baby belonged to the other woman. Solomon asked for an explanation, and the first woman said, "My lord king, we are two women and we were sleeping with our babies in one bed. This woman in her sleep rolled over on her child and it died. So she picked up her dead baby and laid it beside me while I was sleeping. Then she took my child as if it were her own. In the morning, I saw that it was not my child. But this woman says the dead baby is really mine that I rolled on, and the living baby is hers. Now, O king, I beg you to command this woman to give me back my own living child." The second woman said tearfully, "My lord king, that's not true. The dead baby is hers and the living child is mine. Does a mother not recognize her child even from birth? This woman is trying to take my baby away from me." The young king listened to both women carefully. A prayer was in his heart that the Lord would reveal the truth to him. Then he said to a guard, "Bring me a sword." The guard took out his sword and held it towards Solomon. But Solomon ordered the guard, "Take the sword and cut the child in half. Give half to each woman." Instantly, the second woman cried out tearfully, "Not kill my baby. Let the other woman have it. Let the child stay alive." The first woman answered angrily, "No, cut the child in two and divide it between us. That's what she deserves for lying about me." Solomon held out a hand to stop the guard and said, "Give the living child to the woman who would not have it slain, for she is its true mother." All the people in the throne room were amazed at Solomon's wisdom in finding the true mother. They saw that God had given Solomon great understanding, and they told this story to everyone they knew. As time went on, Solomon knew he needed advice from more experienced men. He called to him some of the best and wisest men who had helped his father David. He asked them to stand beside him and advise him as he judged. They were men tried and true, and he knew he could depend on them as he grew into his kingship. This willingness to take advice from more experienced people, even if you're the king, is another sign of Solomon's humility. God loves people who are not know-it-alls. Solomon also knew that his greatest work would be to build the temple of God. For decades, his father David had filled enormous storehouses with gold, silver, rare woods, beautiful marble and other stones, and valuable jewels to be able to build a truly magnificent temple to the Lord. It would stand on Mount Moriah on the east side and cover the whole mountaintop. Its center would stand right on the very place where Abraham had been commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac, but they were saved at the last minute by God's angels. It was a very holy spot, suited to the most reverent worship of God in the universe. Solomon desired to have the temple built in an unusual way, that is, built with reverence, rather than with noisy crowds of builders all over the mountain, breaking stones, sawing and hammering wood, and building fires to melt and beat out the gold. So he ordered all of the stones to be cut and shaped at the quarry before they were brought to Mount Moriah. All of the wood was to be cut into shape and carved into fancy designs before it was brought to be put together at the temple. So the temple was built in relative peace, without hammering, braying donkeys, yelling men, breaking stones and crashing hammers. In design, the temple looked somewhat like the tabernacle of the congregation. You remember seeing this before: the curtain, the altar, the bin of water, and the Holy of Holies. It was kind of like this in the wilderness. It had these elements, but it was more than twice the size of that little tabernacle of the congregation. In the front, it had a big pool of water called the Sea of Brass, with water to wash the sacrifices instead of the little bin in the tabernacle. The Sea of Brass was huge and stood on the backs of 12 oxen, which stood for the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I could describe all of the parts of this gorgeous tabernacle, this temple, but it would not be clear to your minds how fabulous the place was. So online, I found an animated video that will take you on a tour of Solomon's whole temple. So watch with me as I try to show it to you.
Solomon's temple stood in Jerusalem for almost 400 years. It was the crown jewel of Jerusalem and the center of worship to the Lord. Almost half of the Old Testament writings took place during the time when Solomon's temple was still standing. Understanding the significance of its location, history, and design can greatly add to one's reverence for one of the most holy places in the world. The city of Jerusalem is located in an area of three major valleys: the Hinnom, the Central or Tyropian, and the Kidron Valley. The mountain range between the Central and Kidron Valley is called Mount Moriah. The peak of the mountain is a large protruding flat rock, which is now located under the dome of the rock. At the time of King David, the area of Jerusalem was controlled by the Jebusites, the city only occupying the southern part of the central ridge. When David captured the city in about 1000 BC, he made Jerusalem his capital. David then moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and began preparations for building a permanent structure to replace the portable tabernacle of Moses that had been used for over 400 years. With the ancient city of Jerusalem being fairly small, David purchased the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite so he could expand the size of the city. Being higher than the city of David, the hilltop would make a beautiful place to build the temple of the Lord. Under the reign of David's son, King Solomon, the temple construction began. After 7 years of construction in about 960 BC, Solomon finished building the temple, most likely built over this same protruding rock of Mount Moriah. Solomon also built himself a new palace just south of the temple and expanded the walls of the city up towards the peak of Mount Moriah. The Temple of Solomon was modeled after the Tabernacle of Moses. Because of the many similarities between the tabernacle and the Garden of Eden, many scholars believe that the Garden of Eden was the prototype for the tabernacle, and thus later temples. The tabernacle was divided into three main courts: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The outer court represented the fallen world, while the inner courts represented a more sacred and holier way of life. Solomon's temple replicated the same three-level progression, doubling the floor plan size of the tabernacle sanctuary for the temple structure. As one approached the Temple of Solomon, the first thing noticed was the brazen altar of sacrifice. The altar was 20 cubits long and wide and 10 cubits high, a cubit being the length from the elbow to the tip of the longest finger, or about 1.5 feet. On the four corners of the altar were 4 horns, horns often representing power. This is where the sacrificial animals were burned. On the southeast side of the temple was the molten or brazen sea, which rested on the backs of 12 oxen, 3 pointing in each of the cardinal directions. In ancient times, oxen represented strength, and the number 12 often represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Water from the larger brazen sea was poured into 10 bronze water basins on both sides of the temple, which could then be wheeled around the outer court for various washing and cleansing rituals by the priests. Around the south, west, and north sides of the temple were 3 floors of chambers or storage rooms. The inside wall of the chambers was stepped so as to create a ledge where the timbers of the floors could rest. The storage rooms were accessed by a door on the south side of the temple, with wooden ladders going up into each of the floors. At the front of the temple were 2 large bronze pillars that flanked the porch. The pillar on the left was named Boaz, and the pillar on the right was named Yakin. The tops were decorated with lily flower petals and pomegranates. The main temple doors were made of two large bifolding doors covered in gold with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. The Bible describes the doorframe as being a fourth part of the wall, which most scholars believe means that the door had four stepped frames. The interior doorway of the Holy of Holies was similar, except having 5 frames instead of 4. The priests, who represented Israel, were the only ones allowed into the inner temple. This means that Israel only could enter through being represented by the priests. Once you entered the main doors, you entered the holy place, a large room 40 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. The room was overlaid with gold and decorated with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, possibly alluding to the beauty of the Garden of Eden. The room was lit by 10 large menorahs, 5 on each side of the room, that were constantly burning, and narrow windows on each side of the top of the room. On the right side of the room was located the table of showbread, which had 12 large flat pita-like loaves. The priests ate and then replaced the showbread every Sabbath, similar to our weekly partaking of the communion or sacramental bread. Breaking bread and sharing a meal with someone in ancient times represented that you were at peace with them and was a sign of brotherhood, love, and forgiveness. Directly in front of the Holy of Holies was the altar of incense. The altar was similar to the altar of sacrifice in that it had a square footprint and also had 4 horns, 1 on each of the corners. However, on the altar of sacrifice was burned the flesh of animals, while upon the altar of incense burned a sweet combination of incenses. The incense burning before the veil of the temple represented the prayers of the saints ascending to God before the veil, who symbolically guarded the dwelling place of God. As the high priest passed through the veil, he had to pass these angels, who, like in the Garden of Eden, guarded the way back to the presence of the Lord. Upon entering the Holy of Holies, you would find that the room is in the shape of a perfect cube, being 20 cubits wide, long, and tall. The walls were likewise overlaid with gold and decorated with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. 2 large cherubim flanked the Ark of the Covenant, which was in the center of the room, with their wings stretching from one side of the room to the other. This room is where the presence of the Lord would dwell and represented the final goal and destiny of all Israel. Solomon's temple was not only a landmark for the city of Jerusalem, but more importantly, the dwelling place of the Lord. The layout represented Israel's progression back into God's presence and was designed to teach Israel that it was only through the infinite sacrifice of the sinless Messiah that they could once again enjoy the presence of the Lord. A sacrifice that would be performed on a cross only a short distance from this holy mountain.
After seeing this video, you know a lot more about the temple than most Christians know, or even Jews. But there are 2 things I want you to notice. First, those cherubim. Nobody knows what cherubim really were. Nobody knows what they looked like. But some researchers think they looked like winged lions with human faces. Very Egyptian looking. So that's how they were shown in this video. Someday we will know for ourselves what they looked like, but not in this life. Second, you remember that the ark was a chest of gold in which were kept 2 stone tablets of the 10 Commandments that were carved by the finger of the Lord. These stone tablets were still in the ark when Solomon's temple was built, but originally the ark also held a container of miraculously always fresh manna. That's what the people would eat every morning, and the staff of Aaron that was sprouted with living almond blossoms. But these last 2 items had disappeared during the last 4 centuries, perhaps during the thefts of the ark during wars they had with enemy countries who stole the ark for a while. So here's a good illustration of what the Ark of the Covenant really looked like. Again, someday in heaven, we will be able to see it for real. In heaven, we will be able to see anything in history by the power of God. Won't that be cool? It took 7 years to build the temple, but at last it was finished. An enormous congregation from all over Israel gathered when the temple was set apart for worship of the Lord. Innumerable offerings were burned on the enormous altar. King Solomon knelt on a platform in front of the altar and stretched up his arms to heaven. He offered a prayer to the Lord in front of all the people who filled the courts of the temple. He begged for the Lord's blessings and protection upon the people and their land and upon this temple. After the temple was finished, the Lord appeared to Solomon again in a dream or a vision. He said to Solomon, "I have heard the prayer you offered to me, and I have made this house holy. It shall be my house, and I will dwell here. And if you will walk before me, as David did, doing my will, then your throne will stand forever. But if you turn aside from following me, I, the Lord, will leave this house and turn away from you. And let the enemies of Israel come and destroy this house that was built for me." Oh, no. I will now give you a spoiler and tell you that the enemies of Israel did come and destroy this beautiful temple much later. They stripped off all the gold and jewels and valuable things and took them back to their own countries. But you will see why and how it finally happened in later stories. But for now, see you later.